Hello and welcome to the New City Podcast, where we exist to renew the Quad Cities by restoring the health of its people. I am Jarek Bakken.
I'm Dr. Alex Well.
And today we are on to principle number 2, principle number 1 of our nutritional principles. The human body needs to eat real food most of the time in order to survive and thrive. So, multiple things happening here. Number 1, we've kind of moved from our overarching principle, the idea that to obtain health is very, in some ways very simple as 2 rules: give the body what it needs and stay away from what it doesn't. But now we're taking the jump over to, okay, what are the specifics of that? And then when we look at the specifics, there may be nothing more important than nutrition.
Right. So this would be just applying that first principle to food or to nutrition. And that kind of is what justifies this first principle of our central tenet that we call it of nutrition.
Right. So when we obviously there's many reasons to believe that nutrition is, one of the most important factors, if not the most important factor in health. But I think one of the more compelling things that I've ever heard about this is your digestive system is the only system in the body that is specifically designed to take things from outside your body and bring them into your body, right? That happens elsewhere, through the skin and stuff, but this is the system that's explicitly designed to take something in through the mouth, right? And the entire process of the system is, how do we take that, extract from it what the body needs, and put it to use, right? And then eliminate what it doesn't need, right?
Right. Yeah, some people would make the argument that even when something is inside your digestive tract, it's still outside of your body because it hasn't entered into that internal system where it can get to other parts of your body and infect other systems or tissues in your body. Yeah, that's way better.
Sorry, yeah.
But so kind of what we're trying to, I guess, apply from the outside, the body naturally or internally does on the inside. So we're saying give the body what it needs, stay away from what it doesn't. That's really how the digestive system works. The digestive system has this intelligence within it that says, oh yeah, this is a nutrient that I can absorb into my body because that's what my body needs. And if it's not that, then I'm going to get rid of it through, process of elimination.
Right.
So the whole digestive process is actually a good kind of illustration for what we're talking about here with this principle.
Yeah. Cool. So in the realm of nutrition, we say that the first thing that we're going to look at, the most important thing that we're going to look at, is this idea of real food. Above anything else, if we start eating real food, we think that's low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. Pun intended here. Low-hanging fruit. If there's something as a simple rule that we can apply here that's going to make massive amounts of change, it's real food.
Yep. Yeah, and there's a number of different reasons for that. I mean, I would like to start with, again, we're trying to apply that first principle to this so we know when we compare real food with what we are going to define as processed food, or you can just even say fake food, unreal food, but that could probably sound like it would be a good thing, unreal food. Yeah, joke there. We know that the body does better, meaning it does just what we talked about. It absorbs things better from a real food and gets rid of what the body doesn't need from that. Where when you put a processed food, it's more difficult. The body has to work harder to extract nutrients, things that the body needs, and get rid of stuff that it doesn't. So really the definition of real food is what our body does the best with, would be one of those definitions. But what we found is real food is stuff that's just found in nature. Mm-hmm. Stuff that you can pick off of a tree, stuff that you can pick out of the ground because you farmed it, or stuff that is actually living and you can kill it and eat the meat from it. or milk it and take the dairy from it, those type of things. So anything that's kind of found in nature that you can look at history and say people have been doing this for thousands and thousands of years, and especially a long time ago, people were far more healthier than we are, just from a physical, emotional, mental standpoint. And it wasn't until we started kind of processing things
Right.
that we started to see all these problems. So that's at least a couple of the arguments for why we start with this real food thing.
Right. So essentially, it's we. The fact that we have to define real food is a modern thing.
Yeah.
The fact that there is even a category of substance that you would eat and consume, like this is kind of part of the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
So prior to that, yes, anything that you would eat, right? Like we call that real food, right? So what? I don't know how deep you want to get into this, but like what? Where does not real food come in, and how do we define that, and how do we kind of categorize that and give people a much better understanding of what we mean by actually you need to avoid these things?
Yeah, most what we would say is that's not a real food is where you take a real food and then you process it. So you either mechanically alter it, you change it. So like you take a corn, which is a real food,
right,
and then you process it down into corn oil, right? So now you've highly processed, you mechanically altered that food to where now it changes the structure of that food. And now when it enters the body cannot absorb, the body cannot assimilate, the body cannot digest and eliminate those things properly. Or you can chemically alter a food, right? So you can take kind of the beginnings of what a real food is, but then you add all of these additives, preservatives, these colorings, these chemicals, even things like sugar, refined sugar. So you do primarily those two type of things, and now you have highly processed the food and made it into something that's the body doesn't do well with.
Right. So taking a real food, changing what it is, and and it's not like that. It's not like that's always bad, but like
Right.
there's definitely ways that goes real bad.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're actually saying adding in things that aren't food, that
Right.
never started as food,
Right.
layering that on top of what was a much healthier thing to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
than making it bad. Because it's not that, it's not that when you take red dye and put it into wheat and make a red velvet cupcake, right? It's not that necessarily did anything bad to the wheat.
Right.
It's just that now cupcake became vehicle for you eating red dye,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. And this might be a little bit of a, I don't know, what do you call that when you get off track?
A rabbit trail?
Rabbit trail, what they're finding, especially when they look at people with autoimmune disease. Gluten is a big trigger of the body producing antibodies, which is a portion of why somebody would get an autoimmune disease. So you've heard of celiac disease. That's where somebody has a significant problem with gluten. If they have gluten, it damages their digestive tract and causes a lot of sickness for these people. Well, they know that one of the reasons why that can happen is because when you combine something like a gluten that's already the body already reacts to, colorings attached to that protein, and then it kind of magnifies that process.
Yeah.
So even though gluten could be a problem for somebody if you're eating gluten with coloring, so yes, the coloring doesn't necessarily do something bad to gluten, but how the body sees that and reacts to it absolutely can be worse for you. So moral of the story, stay away from red velvet cake, I think.
Red velvet cupcakes.
But then the last piece of the and just this phenomenal guide that we came up with reminded me of this. You can take kind of, because human intelligence is so amazing, and they can use their imagination to figure these things out. You can take something like an apple and see, okay, here's what the brain recognizes as the taste of an apple, and I can, through chemical combining chemicals, I can make something like a caramel apple sucker, which has zero real food in it, other than potentially what that's made, what you use to make caramel, the actual candy of the sucker part is not real food, but it can taste similar to a real food.
Yeah.
So that would be kind of the biggest, furthest away from real food as possible, but something that we still call food for some reason.
All right, so this is another rabbit trail that is bridging off of that. So maybe you know nothing about this. I heard that all current bananas that you can buy are actually like a
hybrid or something.
Some type of hybrid, or the argument was, all these are GMOs. Whatever. It's like well, that's probably not quite accurate, right? But some type of hybrid crop, whatever, not the essentially original banana plant, because that original banana plant became extinct or something. I don't know how plants and trees work. Somebody correct me. So the banana flavored. So the thing that pops in my mind is, you ever have the Runts candy?
You always throw the bananas away.
Whatever, but it's that's the one thing that comes to my head. So banana flavored things are actually the reason why lots of people say, "Oh, this doesn't taste like anything like a banana," is because that is actually modeled after the original plant that nobody's eating anymore.
Interesting.
You ever heard that?
I have heard about the banana thing. I mean, I never looked into why that was the case, nor did I know the Runt reference. But yeah, that's kind of what people can...
You never ate the banana Runts?
I hate those things. Yeah, so just kind of making your own idea of what a food is, calling it food, but it's based off of something we would know as real food, but it's actually... So there's obviously a spectrum here of going from something like picking an apple off of an apple tree to then now what you just brought into the picture of maybe something that was part of the family tree of apples, but no longer like the original apple. I would say that's probably still considered real food.
For sure.
Or at least it's on the spectrum, to then saying, let's take real food and then alter it, add things to it, take things away from it, change its molecular structure, and then you get all the way down here to saying, let's just make something taste like a real food.
Yeah.
That's kind of the spectrum that we would say, if you stay closer over here to the real food stuff, that's what you should be doing most of the time.
Yeah, so some real easy things, some people create these rules about, if you can't pronounce something on an ingredient label, you probably shouldn't be eating it, type of thing. So it's that category of things that are clearly chemical in nature, in colors and whatever. It's okay, I think that's a pretty simple thing for people to grab onto. But I think the kind of two categories that we might define as probably the biggest villains in this realm, categories of industrialized oils, you mentioned both of these already, industrialized oils and then refined sugars. What's going on with those two things specifically?
Yeah, well, the sugar thing, sugar has a ton of just negative effects on the body. One of the things, of course, just something that people would understand is we have sugar in the body. We use sugar as for energy in the form of glucose is what it's known as in the body. So when you eat something that contains forms of sugar, your body breaks it down into glucose, and the body processes it in a way where it can get out into your bloodstream. And then from your bloodstream, it can go into cells. It can go into your muscle cells, liver cells, all brain, all that stuff. So that's a normal thing that happens. But when you, again, don't give the body what it needs, stay away from what it doesn't, if you don't stay away from doing that too often, then now you've kind of overrun your body with sugar. And that's going to spike blood sugar up, which is going to throw off your hormones and then just creates what's called metabolic disease over time. So that's one problem with sugar. Another problem is it's what's called an anti-nutrient, meaning in order for your body to process and deal with how much sugar you're putting in your body, it requires vitamins and minerals. So it requires nutrients to do that. So you're not actually gaining anything by eating that food. You're subtracting things that are already in your body. And again, one of the primary reasons to eat is to nourish your body, to give your body nutrients. So you wouldn't want to eat something that's taking nutrients away without putting anything back in. So yeah, those are just a couple of the thing. But I would say the biggest thing, at least in our context of why people are so sick, is sugar is highly inflammatory. So when you think of heart disease, you think of diabetes, you think of even cancers, Alzheimer's, dementia stuff, those are all inflammatory in nature, meaning that your body's responding to it because there's damage that's been caused in some part of your body, and it responds to damage with inflammation. And that's fine in the short term, right? If you sprain your ankle, it inflames. It's supposed to do that because that's how healing happens. If you get cut, it gets red and it inflames. That's what's supposed to happen because that's how healing happens. Well, when you damage your body so much and there's always inflammation, then now you're leading yourself to chronic disease. And sugar is a big contributing factor to just the inflammatory process. Do you want me to continue going with sugar?
That's good. So then what's the difference then between a real sugar and what we might call a fake sugar, right? So obviously sugar cane is a real food, right? But even honey and fruit, right, full of sugar compared to high fructose corn syrup, other syrups and different ways that we can kind of boil down these processed refined sugars.
Yeah, it's just how your body deals with them. So if you have, so when we look back to the real food stuff, if we look at foods that are found in nature, like an apple or an orange, there's sugar within that food, but it's also come with fiber that's in that food. And the fiber portion of that food kind of, it directs how fast your body deals with that, right? So the whole absorption and assimilation and digestion of the food, a lot of that is determined by kind of the ratio of sugar with fiber. So if you're eating something where you take away all that fiber, that's kind of your body, again, doesn't necessarily recognize it like it would a normal food. So therefore, it's going to change how it deals with that, which then can lead to, again, inflammatory processes. So for people who are, we might be getting ahead of ourselves here a little bit, but what we call insulin sensitive versus insulin resistant, they're of course going to be able to do a lot better. We talked last week about kind of building this hedge. You kind of have more reserve there to deal with more processing or refined sugars versus somebody who's very insulin resistant and kind of lived their whole life where they haven't been doing what they're supposed to be doing, and now their body's in a state where they can't do well with any type of sugar, even the natural type of stuff. So, that's a big conversation, but right. I guess the easy answer is the body doesn't process refined sugar the same way as it does just kind of natural sugar that's found in foods or
the negative effects. So even if you ate like all whole fruits and honey and all this stuff, you're still going to have some negative effects of all that sugar content, right? It's just going to be diluted, essentially, compared to drinking a Coke.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, your body can only store so much sugar, and sugar is an energy, it's a form of energy. So if you're putting in too much, even of the good stuff, your body's still going to try to figure out how to store that, and when it doesn't, right. When it kind of gets to its capacity of storing it in the normal way, it's still going to figure out how to do that, and that's where, it can start to turn into fat, or it can get into your organs and build fat there. A number of different things.
Yeah, and I think there's even the behavioral aspect of it's really easy to slam a Coke, right? Mm-hmm. How much more difficult is it to eat the same number of raw apples that it would take to get to the same sugar content of a can of Coke? Right. And so, and I think that's even true of even smaller degrees of processing, right? It's easier it'd be more challenging to consume the same number of grams of sugar in raw apples versus applesauce,
Right.
or a dried apple, right? Like the kind of it seems like the more and more we process these things in just a general sense, this doesn't always apply, right? But like with something like fruit, or I mean, whatever, sugar. We'll just talk about things that contain sugar. The more something gets processed, and kind of the more dense that becomes, more concentrated the sugar becomes, like it becomes a lot easier to consume a lot more and cause a lot more damage.
Right, and that gets to the the satiety mechanisms that we have in our body.
Sure.
Those hormones and stuff that are released once our bodies recognize that we've had enough food, enough nutrients. If we alter the food, then now those things get bypassed. Which is one of the things they say happens with the high fructose corn syrup. So that's a big reason why a lot of people reject that, is because when you look at kind of normally in nature, the ratio between the types of sugar that are in the fructose versus the sucrose, it's higher in high fructose corn syrup. So now that can bypass the satiety mechanisms that the body's normally going to come up against when it's eating a real food.
Sure.
And that means you're going to be able to have more of it.
Right.
And so you're adding to the calories that you're taking in, which can be a problem.
Yeah, we'll get way more into that when we actually are talking about like macronutrients and stuff. But like you start to add fat into that, and you can start to consume so much.
Yep.
Real quick.
So then the oil thing.
Well, great. Gone to the fat.
Yeah, back. There is. So that within the oil conversation, they can show in research studies that if I take what's called a saturated fat, so something like a coconut oil, that's highly saturated in its fat content, meaning just its molecular structure doesn't have, within molecular structures there's these things called bonds that just keeps things together. And so saturated fat versus unsaturated fat just means that there's more bonds that can be broken. Saturated fat means there's no bonds that can be broken. So when you look at something like a coconut oil that's saturated fat versus something like a corn oil that's what's called a polyunsaturated fat, meaning that there's multiple of these bonds that can be broken. They say, or they can show in research, that this corn oil, these unsaturated fats, lower things like cholesterol, which then they can make the jump from that to saying that's why they're good for your heart.
Sure.
Because they are assuming that low cholesterol is good for your heart.
Right.
Now, without getting into that whole crazy conversation, that's not true. In its looking at it on its own, you can't just say lower cholesterol equals good heart.
Right.
So that's the primary argument that they make for these industrialized oils is eat, I'm sure you maybe have heard of that commercial if you ever listen to just public radio, is there's I forget what the company's called, but if you want to, prevent heart disease and lower your cholesterol, then eat this corn oil. I hear that is if you want to get heart disease and you want to create inflammation in your body, which is the main thing that causes heart disease, then eat corn oil, because that's the biggest problem with the industrialized oils. Because of it not being saturated and it being unsaturated, that means that some things that are called free radicals, which again we're using a bunch of big terms here, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to define these things and explain this a little bit more. But just think free radical is most of the time bad in the body. When that comes up against an industrialized oil or these polyunsaturated fats, it can alter the molecular structure there, and now again it's something that's foreign to the body, which when the body sees something as foreign, it can attack that and create inflammation. Yeah. So the easiest way to understand this is unsaturated fats, primarily polyunsaturated fats, can go rancid easier, or they can be attacked by free radicals easier, or they can oxidate easier. I think most people understand oxidation. That's basically rust, or when you open up an apple and it goes brown, that's oxidized, right? So that same stuff can happen within your body. When these fats get oxidized, they create inflammation, and inflammation leads to chronic disease. So that's why we would make the argument that if you're going to do an oil, you would want to do more of the coconut oil, or if you're going to do unsaturated fats, it would be more like olive oil, avocado oil, those type of things that are more stable. They're not going to break down and create inflammation. Even though they're processed, right? It's not an avocado that you're eating. You're eating the oil from the avocado.
Right.
So it's processed. It's not exactly the 100% real, at least from our definition of real food. But it's going to be far better than something like an industrial oil, which leads to lots of inflammation in the body.
And those are mono unsaturated?
The avocado and the...
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So as far as not real food, chemicals, stuff you can't pronounce most of the time. And that's not to say that like certain things potentially get labeled as like different names on stuff. Granted, a banana is always going to be labeled as a banana, right? Like, garlic and onions are going to be labeled as garlic and onions, but like I think there's certain categories of things that get labeled as like other names. More about.
Well, I know they try to hide things like MSG, or what's called monosodium glutamate,
right?
Because of through research they found that can be a problem for people. So then instead of just saying that that's in here and being honest with people, they try to. It's the same product, but they label it under different names.
Sure.
It's the same thing is happening with like aspartame, which is one of the artificial sweeteners.
Sure. Yeah.
They're just trying to change the name here, or just alter it a little bit so that they can change the name.
Right.
They can put chemicals in foods and then just put it as artificial flavors.
Right.
Or they can even start to do that and say that it's just natural flavors. There's a lot of things that are happening.
And it's not to say that 100% of the things that you don't recognize and can't pronounce on the ingredient label are like avoid like the plague. Not necessarily, but at minimum, they should be causing you to like hesitate, and find out, right? So that's kind of maybe the easiest thing. But then if it's not an animal fat, coconut, avocado, olive, like as far as oils and fats go, a palm, like other than that, you should probably avoid it, right? Yeah. And then this whole category of refined sugars, right? Syrups and everything in this category is probably bad news.
Right. Right. And again, you have to see this stuff in the context of the body wants to be healthy. The body knows how to be healthy. It's just you don't want to interfere with that. You don't want to give the body, you want to give the body what it needs and stay away from what it doesn't. If you don't have that view, then you can start to look at things like I described of, well, let's start with heart disease and let's backtrack and say, well, it looks like people with higher cholesterol have more heart attacks, so therefore high cholesterol must be bad. Then let's look at, well, what foods actually lower your cholesterol when you eat them, and then you make this jump to say, well, if you want to prevent heart disease, you start to eat there. We wouldn't want to do that. We would say, well, the body wants to be healthy, the body knows how to be healthy, then now let's start with real food, because we found in the foods that are found in nature, the body does the best with and knows how to deal with those things. And then now you can get down to what food you actually should be eating, right, and how much you can alter it to see, okay, well, how does the body react to this particular food? And we know that the industrialized oils and the refined sugars are more inflammatory. The body doesn't respond properly, at least what we would say a healthy response would be. Yeah. It doesn't adapt in the proper way to those things. So that's why we would say avoid those.
Yeah. So I think we've also done a decent job of defining what we would classify as real food, right? Essentially, anything that has been introduced in the past 100 years or so with the Industrial Revolution, like that's where all this not real food has come into play. But even when we're looking at real food, animals and plants, right? Those are pretty much our categories. There's still a spectrum of like at the bottom we're going to call good, right? Anything in that spectrum we're going to call that good, and then there's still definitely a spectrum between good and best.
Yeah.
Right? What are some of those categories?
Yeah. Well, I think this could be different person to person, but
Sure.
Generally, meat would be in that high category, but you would want to give some, you'd want to get more specific with that and saying meat can be altered or can be processed just like these other things that we're talking about.
Right.
If you look at, but with the meat, it starts kind of in the beginning of how is the animal actually treated before it gets to be meat on your plate. If this animal is not treated properly as far as it's not able to move, which is one of our principles. Obviously, human body needs to move. Well, so do cows, so do pigs, so do chickens. They need to move. So if they're not able to do that, then that's going to cause them problems. And then if they are injected with hormones and given antibiotics and vaccinated, which includes chemicals, if all of those things are happening, well, now you have a different animal than one that's either, hunted for, that's living out in the wild, or something that's raised, organic, pasture raised, humanely raised animal. So that is one category. It's a huge category to look into there.
Right.
But then even if you just look at something like a beef versus a chicken, beef's going to have a lot more nutrients in it versus a chicken. Organ meats are going to have a lot more nutrients in them than even just muscle meats. So there's a bunch of different categories there. But a couple of the big ones that they would be considered real food, but they still can be problematic for people would be grains, dairy, even legumes for people. Can be problems. And there's just, again, what are called anti-nutrients, things that are found within these foods, because everybody thinks plants are just, something that sits there in your room that gives, brings some oxygen to that's what they do, right? Brings, how's that work? We give carbon dioxide and they give oxygen.
Right.
I remember my botany class. But it wants to survive. A plant, especially plants that give off fruit, they want to propagate. They want to spread and expand. Yeah. They want to be fruitful, multiply. And part of how we interact with them is we eat their fruits and then we spread them to other places so that they can propagate. So there's times when plants don't want you to eat them, and there's some plants that don't spread by that way, so they don't want you to eat them. So they can come up with these what are called anti-nutrients, meaning that instead of it giving you nutrition, the body has to work really, really hard to get nutrition out of that, and it has to use nutrients that are already stored in the body to actually get anything out of it. So, and which then also they can be inflammatory. So gluten is probably the biggest one. So gluten is just a protein that's found in some of the grains, like wheat, barley, and rye are the primary ones. But there's also a lot of other stuff that's found in grains that can be problematic for people. Dairy, I would say some people have an issue just because of environment that they've maybe been in through their whole life, or just kind of epigenetic stuff that's been passed down to them, where they might not even do good with organic, pasture-raised, grass-fed dairy products. But primarily the problem with dairy is because of how we've altered it, right? So now we have injected the hormones into the cows, we've vaccinated the cows, we've put antibiotics in these cows, and then we've pasteurized the milk, we've homogenized the milk, which destroys the nutrients in the milk. So when they say vitamin D, vitamin A, they have to fortify the milk. That's because a lot of that stuff got destroyed when they've heated it up, and they... Do we want to go down that road? So even just that process is based off of germs equal disease. Sure. So if you don't pasteurize the milk and get rid of all the germs that could be in this dirty cow that you just milked, this disease-infected cow, I guess, that you don't want to drink the milk from, so you better heat it up really hot so that this stuff gets destroyed. That doesn't just destroy bacteria and pathogens, it destroys nutrients. So now you're getting a depleted, it's not as nourishing as it could be if it was in its raw and unpasteurized form, but then they put it through this homogenization, which then they alter the size of the, specifically the fat. So if you've ever had kind of milk from a cow, straight from a cow, it's separated. Right, so there's fat at the top. That's different from the liquid. They homogenize it. So they mix all that together, and they've now altered the molecular structure. So again, just like processing of a corn to an oil, just like processing of a wheat to a powder, it's going to respond differently in the human body.
Yeah.
So that's why pasteurized, homogenized, antibioticized, that type of stuff,
That's a word.
type of milk. And then you add chocolate to it.
And extra sugar.
And extra sugar. And then strawberry flavoring.
And red.
Yeah. So that stuff, definitely don't do it for a post-exercise recovery drink. But I wouldn't do it anytime.
Oh, that's funny. That was a jab. What's funny is I think this goes into it. We've talked in multiple places about how a lot of times the most real foods actually are the most delicious. They taste the best, right? Like you look at fine dining, most of them are using the best and highest quality ingredients.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because they're the healthiest, but because it's the best experience that they can provide, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that, since you're talking about the milk, like in all of my life, I've never been like a big milk drinker, right? And then since cleaning up my diet, it's like, okay, like there's these things like almond milk and coconut milk and whatever. So it's like, we'll have that type of stuff around to make in a smoothie or whatever. But a couple of years ago, you guys were making kefir, and you give me those cultures, and I was like, okay, I'll try this out. And I think that was the first time ever that I probably bought in like whole milk, but like I bought good milk, and I was doing that. And, like you're saying, the cream rises and all this type of stuff. And probably the first time in my life that I've ever tasted that. And I was like, wow, this is really freaking delicious, right? Like, never had that experience before.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that is true. Because the stuff that we see as, tasty now, and we're both would fall under this because we have one of the tenets that we have applies that. Things like donuts, things like, ice cream, all this stuff. The reason that stuff tastes good for us now is not because it's necessarily tastes better than other stuff. It's because our bodies have been trained to think that is what the best tasting thing is. Things like sugar. One of the things we didn't mention about sugar is it can excite things in the brain. Yeah. To turn on these pleasure centers in the brain, which then the brain says, I like that, so give me more of that. Mm-hmm. So, that it's kind of it's a tricking really of the body saying, this is what tastes good. Yeah. But I think just experientially, we've noticed once we stay away from that stuff, then other stuff starts to taste better. Yeah. And then when you go back to eating that stuff that you used to eat, it actually doesn't taste the best, because sometimes, a lot of times, it's too sweet, or you're just like, I can't believe that I used to eat this type of stuff, and you're just disappointed. Yeah. Well, one of that's because your brain's gotten away from doing that all the time, so no longer was it this huge excitatory thing that happened because it wasn't trained to be like that anymore. Yeah. Sweet. I think we did pretty good there. So, the human body needs to eat real food most of the time. We'll get there in defining most of the time here in coming episodes in order to survive and thrive. Again, we're trying to do our best to give good general overviews of all this stuff. But for you to get benefit out of this, you have to do something in your life, right? What was I just saying to Haley yesterday? Like, essentially, we are to call somebody to health. You are asking them to change, to do something hard, and to change your behavior, right? If you are in a state of unhealth, if you're not happy with where you're at currently, the truth is, the system you have in place, what you are doing in your life, is perfectly set up to get the outcome that you're getting.
if you want a different outcome, if you want to be healthier, if you want to lose weight, whatever it is, if you want to be the person who works out and not the person who sits on the couch for too many hours a day, it requires positive change in your life to get there. Your life is going to have to look different, and change is going to have to occur. And it's going to be kind of difficult, right? Change is not easy, but necessary, right? So if this is you, and if you want to make positive change, we do want to help. And that's what we believe the most important role of a coach to be, is to help you as an individual to actually create change and implement these things into your life, not just have the conversations about them, not just talk theoretically and understanding what would happen if you ate real food, but to help you figure out what it looks like for you to eat real food most of the time in order to survive and thrive. So if this is you, we'd love to help you. First thing to do, you can just go to newcity.fitness/start, set up a time to come in and talk.
Word.
Sweet.